Today we're going to be taking a look at the cardiac cycle as part of the Cardiology series. Just as a quick recap, it's important to understand the basic cardiac structure. And if you remember, we have 4 chambers of the heart with the 2 atria at the top and 2 ventricles at the bottom. And we also have the great vessels of the heart which bring blood in and out, allowing it to be pumped efficiently. For the purpose of this video, we're going to be using a simplified diagram, which is not anatomically correct, but it helps to explain the process of the cardiac cycle a bit more easily. From this diagram, the deoxygenated blood is pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs via the pulmonary artery, at which point it becomes oxygenated and returns to the left atrium of the heart via the pulmonary vein. At the same time, we have another loop of the heart where oxygenated blood is pumped from the left ventricle to the rest of the body via the aorta, and then deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium of the heart via the vena cava. If we take a closer look at the heart, we can see that there are valves between different sections. So for example, we have valves between the atria and the ventricles, which are termed the atrioventricular valves. And these are composed of the tricuspid valve on the right and the mitral valve on the left. Additionally, we have a set of valves between the ventricles and their corresponding arteries. So as you can see, we have the pulmonary valve on the right-hand side and the aortic valve on the left. And these are collectively termed the semilunar valves. And the main function of these valves is that they can basically open and close to control the flow of blood through the heart, and this allows the whole system to pump blood efficiently to the lungs and the body. There are a few key concepts to understand before looking at the cardiac cycle directly, and the first concept involves the idea of pressure gradients. To explain this, when we have 2 linked systems of a fluid, the blood will tend to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure, down a pressure gradient. Importantly, if we have 2 chambers and one of the chambers contracts, this increases the pressure in the contracted chamber and drives blood again from a high pressure to a low pressure, as before. The other key concept to understand is the idea of valve control. So again, we have 2 linked systems here with deoxygenated blood this time, and the blood flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure down a pressure gradient. However, once the blood reaches this lower chamber, you can see that the pressure gradient has now been reversed, and therefore the blood returns to the upper chamber, again following the pressure gradient. Left to its own devices, the blood would continue cycling between each chamber until an equilibrium would be reached. And you can see that this would not be efficient enough for pumping blood around the body. To resolve this problem, the body has a set of valves which help to control the flow of blood. So again, in this instance, we can see that we have more blood in the upper chamber compared to the lower one. So the blood is forced from the upper chamber to the lower chamber via this pressure gradient. At this point, you can see that the pressure gradient has now been reversed, so there's more blood in the lower chamber compared with the upper one, and it should therefore try to move back into the upper chamber. However, when the blood tries to move back into the upper chamber in this instance, it closes the valve instead, therefore preventing backflow. And this is how blood can be controlled within the heart. To summarize this, valves are unidirectional, so they only allow flow in one direction, and they help to prevent the backflow of blood. Having understood these main principles, we can now move on to review the cardiac cycle. And just to make this easier to understand, we're going to start by draining the heart, so there's no blood in the atria or the ventricles at present. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is called diastole. And as you can see, in this position, the atrioventricular valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. During diastole, the heart muscles are relaxed and blood is brought into the atria via the vena cava and pulmonary vein respectively. At this point, you can see that there's a pressure gradient, so there's more blood in the atria compared with the ventricles, and blood therefore moves from the atria down into the ventricles via pressure gradient. And this can only occur because the AV valves are open. Importantly, this first phase is a passive process, so there's no contraction involved, but the blood is merely flowing down its gradient. Moving on to the second phase, which is atrial systole. In this phase, both atria contract and push any remaining blood in the atria down into the ventricles via the open atrioventricular valves. You can see that all of the blood from the atria has now reached the ventricles. The third phase of the cardiac cycle is the start of ventricular systole, and more specifically it's called isovolumetric contraction. To explain this, both ventricles start to contract, which increases the ventricular pressure. As you can see, the blood wants to move back into the atria due to the pressure gradient which has been established. However, because of the presence of the AV valves, instead of the blood moving back to the atria, it forces the valves closed instead. And this is actually what is responsible for the first heart sound, or the S1 heart sound, to be heard. The closing of the atrioventricular valves is important because it helps to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles back into the atria for the next step. The reason why this phase is called isovolumetric is because you can see that there's been no exchange of volume of blood, there's only been an increase in pressure. With the atrioventricular valves closed, we can move on to the next phase of ventricular systole, which is called the ejection phase. During this phase, the ventricles continue to contract and contract fully, and this increases the ventricular pressure significantly. As a result of this rise in pressure, the semilunar valves end up opening, and the blood is forced from the ventricles into the pulmonary artery and aorta respectively. At this point, the deoxygenated blood can be moved to the lungs, and the oxygenated blood can be transferred to the rest of the body. The final phase of the cardiac cycle is called isovolumetric relaxation, and during this phase, you can see that the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery is far greater than the ventricular pressure. As a consequence of this increased pressure, the semilunar valves are forced close, and this is what's responsible for the second heart sound, or the S2 sound, to be formed. After this phase, the atria fill with blood again, and the atrioventricular valves open once more. And you can see that the entire process repeats from here, so we've returned back to diastole now. Just to explain everything on one slide, we have a summary table here which outlines the key actions during each phase of the cardiac cycle, as well as the positioning of the valves in each point. And we also have a diagrammatic summary of the entire process as well. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.